Hello, my name is Christina Taylor, and I'm a paper conservator at the Straus Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at the Harvard Art Museums. Today I'm coming to you from my home studio, where I'll be demonstrating the Jigsaw Woodcut printing technique that Edvard Munch used to make the print Woman's Head Against the Shore in our collection. As you see here, we have two impressions of this print in the collection. Munch was an extremely experimental artist, and the way he approached making his woodcuts was very unique. You'll probably notice right away that Munch used very different colors when printing each of these impressions. As I progress through my demonstration, I will be pointing out some of the other differences between these prints, and that'll help us learn more about how Munch worked. The Munch Museum in Norway not only has an extensive collection of Munch's prints, but also his wood blocks. Here are the blocks from their collection that Munch carved and printed to make Woman's Head Against the Shore. We can learn a lot just from looking at these blocks. The one on the left is referred to as the key block because that's where we see the majority of the carved composition. And the one on the right is referred to as the color block. Although there is some carving, the main purpose of the color block is to add additional layers of color to the print. The main thing to notice about both of these blocks is that each of them has been cut into two pieces. Munch started with two rectangular blocks, then he carved the designs, and then with a handsaw, he cut each block into two parts, which ultimately gave him 4 blocks. Cutting the blocks in this way gave Munch the opportunity to experiment with different inking and with different compositions. For my demonstration today, I'll be making a small reproduction of this print to walk through the steps of Munch's process. These are the small blocks I'm going to use for the demonstration. Munch used a wide variety and types of woods to make his woodcuts, but for this print he used a cherry and a spruce. This is the cherry block I'm going to use for the color block, and although this isn't spruce, I selected a similar wood with a very distinct wood grain because the wood grain is something that's very visible in the key block when printed in Munch's prints. So what I'm going to do next is transfer the image onto both blocks, and then I'm going to start carving. I stained the key block so when I go to carve, I can more easily see my progress. I used a white transfer paper, similar to a carbon paper, to transfer the outlines of my images to both blocks. Munch utilized what's considered a white line carving style in most areas of the print, with the exception of the figure's face. Anything that is carved away will not ink up in print, so white line is referring to the color of the white paper coming through the image. We will soon see that Munch layered his blocks in a way where these areas aren't necessarily white in the end. So now I have the blocks carved, and although it's possible that Munch could have printed or proofed the blocks at this stage, there are no known impressions of this print before he cut the blocks into 2 sections. Even the earliest known proofs were printed from cut blocks. So that's what I'm going to do next. This is the coping saw that I'm going to use to cut the blocks, and Munch used something similar called a fret saw. And the main difference is that a fret saw has a deeper throat to accommodate larger blocks. For this reproduction, I'm doing a much smaller piece, so I can get away with using the smaller coping saw. Munch was trained by a neighbor carpenter at a young age, so he was very capable and knowledgeable about using saws. He likely clamped the block vertically in a vise, as opposed to parallel with the table, like I have it here. Now that both blocks are sawn in 2, I can begin inking and printing them. For this demonstration, I'm going to be recreating the inking of both impressions in the collection, really to point out some of the differences between them, but also to show how Munch utilized the jigsaw printing technique. But before I begin inking, I'm going to walk you through some of the close looking I did to determine what colors Munch used to make the prints. I'm going to start with this impression. Because the two blocks, the key block and the color block, overlap in so many areas, and because Munch used transparent inks, which alter the color once layered and printed, it's not so obvious at first glance what colors he printed with. We're going to start by looking at the color block. And this green line indicates where the color block was sawn in two pieces. The first color printed from the lower portion of the color block we can see most clearly. This is the orange color that's most visible in the figure's face. The upper portion of the color block was printed in this beige color. Most of the beige is overlapped with the color from the key block to make the green background. So although the upper portion of the key block is completely inked and printed in beige, it's only visible in these few areas as just beige. So for this impression, I will be inking the lower portion of the color block in orange and the upper portion in beige. Next, we'll look closely at the key block. Munch actually used the same colors to print both halves of the key block. However, instead of only inking the block in one solid color like he did with the color block, he inked each half with two colors. The arrows here indicate where the two colors come together in a gradient. You can see at the left portion of the print, the gradient sits a little higher than at the other half. If we take a closer look, we can see the lower portion was inked in this bright teal color. And to reiterate, where the beige from the color block and the teal from the key block overlap, they combine to create the dark green we see in most of the background. The upper portion of the block is a little harder to determine because Munch did not carve the blocks in that area, so I'm making a guess and plan to use the same orange that we see in the figure's face. So I will be inking both halves of the key block with orange and teal, with the gradients landing at slightly different heights on the blocks. Munch inked each portion of the block separately. This gives a hard edge and really differentiates portions of the composition. This is the lower half of the color block, and I'm inking in orange. It's a little hard to see the ink on this dark cherry wood, but I'll be looking at the sheen to determine when I have enough ink. The inks likely stained Munch's block over time, so that's why in the images of the blocks at the Munch Museum, the color block is yellow and blue instead of cherry wood colored. And I'll ink the upper half of the color block in beige. Now I'm bringing both inked halves to the press and joining them back together for printing. This is my registration system I'm using to make sure both layers are aligned together in the right place. There are many types of registration, and this is just one example. I'm printing on white paper because that's the color Munch used for this impression. Newsprint is added to keep everything clean, and this brown chipboard protects the block and paper from the hard metal rollers in the press. Although this press is motorized, Munch used a similar roller-style press for printing. And here's the first layer of the first impression. Now after the first layer has dried a bit, I'm going to print the key block on top. For the gradient, I'm rolling out both colors onto my brayer or roller, and they blend a little where they meet. And then I roll that on the surface of the block. And just as before, the two blocks that were inked separately are joined back together at the press for printing. I'm printing on top of the previous layer. And here it is. Although the color is a little blue and the wood grain is a little wild, I hope you can see that where the colors overlap, new colors are formed, such as in the shape around the figure. And also how the two gradients land in different areas at the top. Now let's quickly look at the second impression to see what changes we need to make when printing. I'll start with the color block again. If we look at the same areas of the print we did before, we can see that Munch used a cream color for the lower portion and a light blue for the upper portion. But what's different about this print is that we can also see that light blue color extend all the way up in a large area at the upper left. So what's going on? Let's take a look at the key block. For this impression, Munch only printed one of the two halves of the key block, which allowed a large portion of the light blue ink from the color block to remain visible because it didn't get printed over and covered up. The half of the key block Munch did print was another gradient, a blend between red at the top and olive green for the rest. I'm inking the lower portion in cream and the upper portion in light blue. Then bringing the pieces together at the press, I'm using a cream paper this time. And here's the first layer. To ink the key block, I'm setting aside the portion I won't be printing. Although I'm using a brayer to ink this gradient, Munch's impression is messier, and he may have even used his fingers or another method to blend these areas together. So now I'm printing just this portion of the block on top of the previous layer. You'll notice that the wood grain pattern that is so visible in the key block is absent at the upper left, because that portion of the block was not printed. The Harvard Art Museum's impressions at the left are two of many different variations that Munch created of this print. He really enjoyed experimenting, and the jigsaw woodcut technique gave him some freedom to make changes and alterations. Now that the demonstration is complete, I hope you can see that for an artist who makes his images look quick and effortless, his techniques are very sophisticated and complex. Cutting his blocks into two sections allows Munch to vary the colors, but also his compositions. The wood he chose, the colors and transparencies of his inks, and also the way he inked the blocks, all had a huge impact on the final print. The two impressions in our collection are great examples to compare when delving into the technique, and I really hope this demonstration has shed some light onto the way that Munch worked. Thanks for watching.